Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining from. We still have people coming in right now and joining, but I'm just going to get started because we have a lot of great speakers today to get through. My name is Stacey Cram. I'm the Policy Director at NAMATI, and I'm pleased to be facilitating today's webinar. It is Wednesday, July 26th, and today we've come together for the online launch of the inaugural SDG16 Data Initiative Global Report. We are joined this morning by John Romano from the Transparency, Accountability and Participation, or TAP Network, Roxana Nanyakara from Transparency International, and Michelle Bressler from the Institute for Economic Peace. All of these speakers are representing organizations who are members of the SDG16 Data Initiative. I'm also joined by colleagues from here at NAMATI and the Global Legal Empowerment Network, Ashley, Maya, Michael, and Kate, who are going to help field your questions and help with the tech side. So I'm just going to ask all of the presenters to turn on their webcams and say hello and good morning to everybody so we can get a sense of who's here. Okay, beautiful faces. I am now going to turn mine off because I'm actually dialing in from California, so it's very early here. Before we get too far in today's presentation, I just have some brief housekeeping. Firstly, just want to take note that this event is being recorded, and we will share the full recording and highlights later on. I just also want to make sure that everyone can hear well and is able to use the webinar system. So you can see there's a question panel at the site where you can type in your questions and communicate with us throughout the presentation. If you're going to send a question, please let us know where you're sending your question from. It's always nice to know where we have colleagues joining from. There's also a button for raising your hand. If you're having any problems, just push that and one of our colleagues will be able to help. There will also be a few polls, well, one poll on today's webinar, and I'll explain how that works when it comes up. But if you see something coming to the front of your screen, don't worry. Today's webinar is being hosted by the Global Legal Empowerment Network, who is a part of the SDG16 Data Initiative. The network is a growing community of more than 1,000 organizations and 4,000 individuals from around the world who are working to advance justice, which is one of the core themes of SDG16. Our members include human rights activists and grassroots organizers, advocates, lawyers, community paralegals, researchers, policymakers, and public servants. The main way that our network members connect is through an online discussion platform. We have webinars like this, face-to-face learning exchanges, a leadership course, and other events. There's an online library of over 1,000 free resources, which you can access. And we collectively advocate together. We worked with all of the members of the SDG16 Data Initiative and the TAP Network to secure that justice was included in SDG16. So you're all invited to join this network, and you can click on the link in your screen. Membership is free and open to all. The SDG16 Data Initiative, who is launching our report today, we launched as an organization at the high-level political forum at the United Nations in 2016. And the Data Initiative was set up to compile existing global data that can help track progress towards the achievement of SDG16, which commits that all countries promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. The data initiative compares the recommended United Nations official indicators for tracking progress towards Goal 16 against complementary indicators from NGOs and other data sources. We are providing the most complete and accurate picture possible of progress towards Goal 16. John is going to tell you much more about this, so I'm not going to spend time on it now, but before we get started into the main presentation, we just have a quick poll. It should pop up on your screen now, and we're just asking, how familiar are you with Sustainable Development Goal 16? We just want to get a sense of people in the room or online, the virtual room. So if you could just click on that, and we will have the results so we can tailor our webinar today for everyone. I'll give everyone just 30 seconds to do that. Great. So we have a few newbies in here. We've got 9% saying that SDG16 is new to them, and the overwhelming majority are somewhat familiar or very familiar. So that is good. You are all welcome, and a lot of you are big geeks like me, I am sure. I'm now pleased to introduce John Romano from the TAP Network. He's going to be followed by Roxana and then by Michelle. Each presenter is going to speak for between 5 to 7 minutes. So, as I said, type in your questions in the panel as we move along, and we'll collect them and do our best to answer every question at the end. There will also be time after the presentation to pose questions, and time permitting, we can also open the floor to people to speak. So let us know via the question panel if you'd like to be unmuted to make an intervention. So without further ado, John, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Stacey, and of course to Namati for hosting this webinar. I just wanted to say I'll be somewhat brief on all of this, or as concise as possible. There's a wealth of information available on the web, not just for the SDG16 data initiative itself, but also for the report that we're launching here. I think it's a lot more interesting for people to just go through it yourselves and really explore all of the data that we have available, and obviously the analyses that we provide in the report. So just for starters, I'll say you can find the SDG16 data initiative. It's SDG16.org. I think fairly simple and straightforward to find. And you can find the report. It's now available, SDG16report.org. So again, fairly straightforward and self-explanatory there. But I think I just wanted to touch on a few points of who we are as the SDG16 data initiative, and a little bit about the report that we've just launched last week. So as Stacey mentioned, the SDG16 Data Initiative, we're a group of 14 organizations and research institutions, all working to help advance SDG16 data, particularly showcasing data sources that come from what you would consider non-official data sources. So data that comes from civil society organizations or academia or research institutions. So basically, data sources that come from outside of official statistical systems or from governments. And for us, I think this was a really important and necessary platform for us to provide. A lot of us within this group, and maybe I'll just take a quick moment to outline who we are as the members of this group. With a Global Forum for Media Development, Institute for Economics and Peace, International IDEA, Governance Data Alliance, Namati, Open Society Foundations, Results for Development, PRIO, Safer World, Small Arms Survey, Sustainable Development Solutions Network, TAP Network, Transparency International, and the World Justice Project. I think that in itself, I think for those of you that have worked around network building and coalition building, it's no small feat to bring together 14 organizations all heading in the same direction to put together a platform like we launched last year, and to put together a report that really examines global progress towards SDG 16. All of us work really on a volunteer basis, and we work together on all of this. And so I think it was a monumental feat to launch both the platform and the report itself. And so what we really aim to do and aim to provide in the first instance through the SDG 16 data initiative, the website and the platform itself, as Stacy mentioned, we do have data sets available for some of the official SDG 16 indicators. I think it's important for us to track progress against the indicators that governments are using to measure their own progress. But also for us, it was also important for us to examine alternative indicators or complementary indicators that can give us a more robust picture of progress. For us, those are the official indicators were just a starting point. And we really wanted to say, what are some of the other ways that you can measure these admittedly complex issues like justice or accountability or peace and transparency, corruption, or bribery. There's a lot of really complex issues within SDG 16. And we wanted to expand the scope of what we're measuring within SDG 16, but also the scope of the data that we're using. As I said, we're using non-official data sources here, so outside of official statistical systems. And so what we really aim to do is collect and curate some of those data sets. I think a lot of our members and a lot of colleagues from civil society, those of you that were engaged in the negotiations on SDG 16, know that the main argument for countries that were against having SDG 16 in the SDG set was that they felt it was difficult or impossible to measure these issues. And for a lot of us, we knew that that wasn't true. We knew that a lot of this data was being collected by some of the institutions, even within the data initiative itself. And so for us, we really wanted to showcase, the data that's available, but also where there may be gaps in data coverage. And I think that's a really important part of this initiative, is to examine the state of data availability around the world on SDG 16. And so with all of that, we knew that there was one part of it where we wanted to provide this platform for people to access and to find data and track progress in real time, basically on their own accord. But for us, I think it was also important, especially 1 year into this, the launch of this data initiative, to really make sense of what this data was telling us. And so at the high-level political forum last week, we launched the first edition of our annual SDG 16 data progress report. You can find sdg16report.org, and for us, it's really an opportunity to assess trends in what the data is telling us, but also again in data availability. And so I won't go into too much detail on that. We have Roxana and Michelle that will give you a bit of information about some of the chapters and the data that we have in that report. And so I think for us, again, just to wrap up, we want to expand the indicators and the data sets that we use going forward. And so I think this is, in many ways, we're only a year into this. We just launched last year. We just had our first report. So in many ways, this is kind of these are first steps for us. And so we would really look forward to working with many of you to see how we can expand the scope of how we measure SDG 16.
Great. Thank you, John. I will make another plug for people to download the report now. And we will keep this slide up as we hand over to Roxana, who is from Transparency International. Roxana. Oh, Roxana, I think you're still muted. Are you able to unmute yourself?
I believe you can hear me now. Hi, my name is Rukshana. I work for Transparency International as the advocacy manager on SDGs. So I believe that many of you who are taking part in this webinar have gone through the SDG16 Data Initiative website or managed to have a look at sdg16.org, the annual report. So in case if you have not done that, so I invite you to do it after the webinar. Because my effort here is not to go through page by page and explain what's in the report and present the data which is in the report. But I think it's rather important for us to highlight the key messages which are coming out from the report, and also to see what are the how you can use this report and why we put this report out. So I'm going to start with one of the data sets that Transparency International has included in this report and that we annually produce, which is the Corruption Perception Index. So that highlights rank countries in the world within a range of 0 to 100 on the levels of corruption in the public sector. 0 being 100 being least corrupt and 0 being worst corrupt. So every year when we put out this data set, there is a market value to this, because countries are very keen to know where they are ranked. So they are interested in knowing how they are ranked in the corruption perception index, and also they are interested in knowing how they have been ranked in comparison to their neighbors and their competitors. So this is the kind of market value that we can create through data. But I think when we use this report, having this data, the numbers, it's important to go beyond that, which I would call the policy value. How would you take this data and use that data effectively to improve the situation? Now, often we get questions from state parties saying that, can you please tell, can Transparency International tell us how to improve our score in the CPI index? So there is no magic formula, but what we can say is that holistically you have to look through the public sector, and this calculated score, the amount, is an indicator of corruption in your public sector. So you need to take action A, B, C, D. So there is another level that we have to move on to and see how do we interpret this data to a policy level. Now, some governments are taking this seriously. Now, for example, governments like Thailand, Malaysia, even Finland have officially adopted civil society data in measuring 16.5 target in goal 16. So it's important to say, why do we have to consider CSO data? When we measure SDG 16 goal, I think it is important that we bring different views and have a multifaceted approach in measuring the goal 16. That way we call a holistic approach in measuring the target. So the role of NGOs is very key here, particularly NGOs, or many of us, or all of us who are here, are international federations or organizations at international level. So operating at international level, we bring a perspective which is coming out from national and subnational level and indicatively present it at the international level. So I'll give another example, also based on the data which is included in this report. So today's world population is more than 7.3 billion people. And one of the data sets that we have included in this report is Global Corruption Barometer. And according to the Global Corruption Barometer, more than 1 billion people in the world, other than Latin America and Europe and Central Asia, have to pay bribes in accessing public services. So if you go to Europe and Central Asia, the report says 1 in 6 households have to pay bribes in accessing public services. So I mean, this is a key finding. Of course, what we are representing here is survey data that we have gathered at the national level and the subnational level, and we are presenting in total at the international level as a number here. So that's why one way of collecting this data is the survey data. Again, I have to emphasize the fact that these survey data are coming from national level and subnational level. So in addition to the survey data, the other alternate is perception data. So some can argue, why do we have to include perception data? Why cannot we always have a direct experience based data. But particularly working in bribery and anti-corruption business, I have to say that corruption happens behind closed doors. So we don't get data directly because in a deal of bribery, for example, both supplier and the demand person are at the wrong end. So in that case, they don't come out and talk about this because they have to face legal repercussions as a result of that. So what we do instead is that we interview people and ask them questions about their perception on bribery and corruption. And these people are the ones that we interview are the ones who actually interact with people who either supply bribery or who demand bribery. So I think in that context, it's extremely important that we gather perceptions as well. Perceptions also important to a certain level to create pressure on governments, because sometimes government departments act based on perception data, because perceptions don't come out within a vacuum. They actually either based on experiences, and often people don't want to directly speak about these experiences, or it shows an accumulation of pattern or a behavior over a period of time. So my last 2 points here is that we present this data, and I think it's important that we use this data to an extent that how do we holistically use this data for across all the SDGs in terms of achieving those SDGs. I'll give an example. 16.4 of SDG goal 16 talks about illicit flows of finances and reducing that by 2030. And the report says in 2014, 2 trillion to 3.5 trillion USD have flown out of developing countries to developed world. I think we need to take that into context of achieving all the SDGs. What does that mean for achieving education targets? What does that mean to achieve health targets? What does that mean to achieve ending poverty or hunger, particularly in those countries where money is going out from? And the other point that I want to say is that though we indicatively present this data in the data report, it's also important in using that, interpreting that, to disaggregate this data and what is the real impact and of this data, and what does it really represent, particularly groups which are not represented in the mainstream. So what about women or other marginalized groups whose data is often not presented in that? I think this is also in one way in the future improving the data initiatives work, and also to a certain extent take into consideration in interpreting the data which is already in that. I'm saying this because now, for example, in our corruption perception index, I said from 0 to 100, and then any country we say which is scored below 50% has endemic issue of corruption, particularly who are in the bottom end of corruption perception index do have a very serious issue of corruption. And what does that mean to marginalized groups in those societies? Because sometimes corruption is not captured through monetary wise. What about favoritism, nepotism, and issues like sextortion, which are not captured in the mainstream? So I think it's important that we get this data and interpret them in a context. What does that really mean to the country, and what does that really mean to some of the marginalized groups, and based on that take certain policy decisions. So my last point is that this present number of data at the global level, we need to create attention and a discussion, but it's equally important in measuring the SDG targets and their achievement. Take this data to national level and subnational level and create a discussion. And both in terms of measuring as well as creating a marketplace of data, data which is presented in this report is extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. And as Roxana said, you can go into the annual report and read more on the corruption indicators in there, and on the website you can drill into individual countries. So if you're If you're joining us from Honduras, for example, you can click onto Honduras and see what is currently being reported at the national or level where you are, and think about how to use that data. So I'd encourage you all to read the report for global trends and use the website for drilling into more localized information. I am now going to invite Michelle to take herself off mute and to make her remarks. Michelle?
Thanks, everybody, and thank you all for joining us on the webinar here today. As was mentioned earlier by Stacy, I'm joining you from the Institute for Economics and Peace, and if you're not familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit research organization that tries to actually measure peace and to understand not only the drivers of peaceful societies, but the economic benefits that reductions in violence can bring to global and national economies. Next slide. So when we're talking about measuring peace, we're likely best known at the Institute for Economics and Peace for our annual Global Peace Index, which is a measure of negative peace. It's looking at the absence of violence or the absence of the fear of violence, and it overlaps quite strongly with Goal 16 in terms of a lot of the indicators that we're looking at. And we produce that index annually. It's also allowed us to do a lot of comparative work and empirical work around trying to understand what the drivers of peaceful societies are from a statistical perspective. So what do we see year on year correlating with the most peaceful countries? And that's represented in our positive peace framework. And this is all to really say that there's a wealth of data that we're working with, and there's a wealth of existing data, and we need to be able to look at what's already there and see what we can learn from it. So next slide. And this is where we're looking at the positive peace framework, some of the factors, and you see that it broadly overlaps as well with a lot of the targets in the full sustainable development goals framework across all of the goals. Next slide. So last year we did an audit on Goal 16, and I want to sort of talk about some of the Goal 16 data and indicators to make the case for why it's important that we have third-party measurement, and really make the case for why the SDG16 data initiative is particularly important. So we look globally at indicators available, and we found that only 2 indicators of Goal 16 can be measured immediately and can be fully disaggregated. So these were the measures of the independence of national human rights institutions and the representation of developing countries in international organizations. Pretty easy in a way to measure. Now, an additional 13 indicators can be measured immediately, but do not have disaggregation or full coverage. A close or similar measure is available for 7 of the indicators, but overall there are measures to gauge progress for all indicators. And so this means that while the official indicator framework is not going to be enough, we do recommend that independent third-party organizations provide this complementary support to national statistical offices and can offer a useful benchmark against which to compare results. And this is what's represented in the SDG16 data initiative. Next slide. Next slide. If we can just go to the next one, I'm going to skip this one. Thank you. And so when we look at Goal 16 in particular, it's particularly important to look at increasing data capacity because the least peaceful countries have among the lowest statistical capacity. So for instance, a key baseline measure for negative peace is violent deaths and homicides. And many people will argue that homicides should be one of the easiest things because it's hard to hide dead bodies. But 3 out of 4 fragile states don't have adequate data available for these indicators. Moreover, for the countries where it is available, much of the data is not comparable over time, and yearly time series are not available. So for instance, most of sub-Saharan Africa does not have comparable homicide data over time, with fewer than 20% of sub-Saharan African countries self-reporting necessary data to the UN. Some of the other challenges to the official indicator framework include the following issues. Next slide. Firstly, availability. So capacity for national statistical offices will take a very long time to build, so we likely will not have data for many years on some of these indicators. Secondly, political issues. Some targets cannot be practically measured by NSOs for political reasons. So let's think about corruption, as Rukhsana talked about, or the killing and detention of journalists and human rights activists. How can governments self-report these types of indicators? Thirdly, methodological and practical concerns. Some targets are multidimensional. So when we think about rule of law, it's something that's very hard to measure with just 2 indicators. Rule of law is measured by the UN Development Program, and their rule of law indicators handbook has over 180 different indicators. How can we look at something as multidimensional as rule of law and have such limited indicators to represent it with? Coverage. Not all of the indicators in the official process adequately cover the full ambition of what the targets say. So for instance, 16.4, there is no indicator to monitor asset recovery and organized crime. Context-specific reasons. I mentioned that the fragile states tend to have the lowest statistical capacity. So in the absence of peace, some countries will not be able to maintain statistical capacity. If we think about, for instance, countries that are in active armed conflicts, it's difficult to maintain statistical capacity around body counts. Capacity. Resources committed to improving statistics still need to be identified and channeled. People don't fund basic statistical capacity data collection, and that's an area where there needs to be a big push in terms of financing. Finally, by design, so when we look at some of these targets and indicators, such as broadening and strengthening the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance, that's not something that any one country can measure, and that's not universal. So this was just to give a little bit of a build-up to why, next slide, we need to have something like the SDG16 data initiative so we can provide this monitor. And I think even further than just having work to fill some of these gaps in measurement, what the data initiative does have the opportunity to do is to also create a platform that engages with civil society. When we look at conflicts and violence today, there are increasingly conflicts within countries, between citizens and government, or interpersonal violence. And this means that there's even more room now for civil society and more importance for civil society to be involved in creating peaceful, just, and inclusive societies and to holding government to account. So by creating platforms like this that allow for people to engage, even as a shadow monitor, I think there's a lot of opportunity to foster discussion, to foster engagement, and then actually start to build towards some of these targets outside of even what's just happening in terms of official measurement or at UN headquarters in terms of reporting back and monitoring. So thanks again.
Thank you, Michelle. That was incredibly interesting, and I think you've done a really good job of explaining why we've put together these data sets and reports. And the one thing I would mention is, you know, the initiative is an ongoing work in progress, and as John kind of mentioned at the beginning, we are looking to see what other kinds of data sets we can bring in over the, you know, next 13 years as we work towards 2030. So these are no means set in stone. We don't think we have all the answers, and we're looking to continually work with other partners and to work with governments and member states to kind of refine and improve this information so that it really is both monitoring what's happening but helping us make progress to these lofty ambitions of Goal 16. Before I open for Q&A, I'm just interested to hear a little more on how the data initiative has been received and how this annual report has been received by member states and other kind of national statistical offices or kind of the official government responses to this initiative. We know that there can often be pushback on this kind of information. And John, you were, you know, I know all three of you were there, but maybe I'll put you on the spot. You were there at the launch last week, and there was a lot of representations from member states and countries at the event. How have they responded to this information, and has it been positive, negative? I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure, thanks, Stacey. Michelle just mentioned the challenge in self-reporting, but I'll make an attempt at self-reporting from our launch last week. So I think Michelle did a really, really great job of outlining some of the challenges going forward, and so I think I won't go into too much detail about some of the questions that we get, you know, regarding you know, methodologies of you know, the data sources that we have. You know, when it comes to those methodologies, we made sure, and we will always make sure, to promote in a really transparent way and really showcase the methodologies of the data sets that we have. I think it's a really important aspect of this is to not just showcase what we have in terms of the data and the indicators, but also take a look and really freely promote how it is that these institutions are actually measuring some of these issues and collecting this data. I think it's a really important opportunity for us to not just be transparent, but also promote you know, those methodologies that in many ways are being pioneered by some of these really great institutions. So there's questions always about, you know, methodologies of the data sources that we curate for the website. There's questions always about comparability of data sets, you know, from non-official sources to official statistical systems. You know, how does the data compare against one another? And again, that's another question about methodology as well. There's always questions about subjectivity of data. You know, are these data sources unbiased if they come from non-governmental institutions? I think it's a fair question in many cases. And then there's also questions, I think partially sometimes about perception and experiential data. So as Roxana mentioned, you know, I think it is really, really important for us to be sure that we're collecting people's perceptions and experiences of progress to complement the sources of data that we have that are purely administrative data that give us the data that we can track progress on in really, I guess, more quantitative ways. But it's really, really important for us to have that, to collect people's experiences on the ground. I mean, that's really what we're after here is progress for the people. But some of the questions that we got from the launch event last week, we had questions also around how we plan on using nationally and locally sourced data. So right now we have just data sets that are really globally comparable data sets, and they come from, I guess, kind of bigger, more global institutions. And so this is something that I'm sure we're going to have to wrestle with. It takes a lot of time and resources, as many of you know, to really work with and identify the relevant national data sources, particularly from civil society or other research institutions. But I think it's an area that we can definitely build upon. There were questions about if we planned on having official statistics showcased on the website. There are, I think in short, we want to showcase as much data as we can. So in theory, I think it would be great to have official statistics on our platform as well, but there's some obvious questions about data privacy and data sharing that we'll have to overcome as well. And then, the final question that we got, I think that was really important for us to consider is on translating. So translating this into other languages, because this is really, in many ways, really technical work around data indicators. And we had a lot of questions about if we had plans to translate these indicators into different languages. So something for us to consider. And like we mentioned, this is kind of a first step for all of us. So as much feedback as we can get, especially in a forum like this, I think is really important for us to really identify, how we take this yearly report on each year and how we improve the data initiative. So I'm curious to get some feedback and questions from colleagues here as well.
That's great. Thanks, John. And the platform is now open. I have a few questions which have already been coming through, but I would encourage everyone who is been listening to arm us with your questions. We have just under 20 minutes, so we can try and get through as many as possible. And if anyone is wanting to make an intervention, as I said, please just write that into the box, and one of my colleagues on the tech side will be able to help with that. So we're going to start with some questions which have come from Matt Trom in the UK, and he might have been in the second or the third option in their first poll, as he's saying, for those of us who are getting up to speed with the SDGs, can you indicate whether all of the indicators and targets for SDG16 are now set, or whether a similar platform like this exists for the other SDGs? And finally, how does this platform link back to other data provided, for example, from the OECD or the World Bank governance data? I can maybe just answer the second one, which is that I have not seen anything like this for all of the SDGs, and we would love to see this be a full SDG piece. But on the first questions there, Ruxana, do you want to come in on whether all of the indicators and targets for SDG16 are set, or John? I know. And Michelle, maybe you could talk a little bit more about how this data links to kind of some of the other data sets that are currently being produced, like the World Bank governance data.
John, do you want to go with the finalization of indicators?
Yeah, sure. I'll answer that very briefly. Theoretically, the quote-unquote official indicators for SDG16 are somewhat set already. They have been agreed by what's called the Interagency and Expert Group on SDG indicators. That's kind of a body of national statistical offices that have been tasked with finalizing indicators for the official monitoring process through the UN. And so the indicators have been set, but by no means are they set in stone. There will be opportunities in the next few years even for us to collectively reassess if we need to add additional indicators or if we need to replace certain indicators. So there is still an opportunity to influence the official process, and I think it is also important for us from the data initiative to keep that into consideration as well when we're taking a look at complementary indicators that we're putting together. How can we make sure that they're also being, that governments are also using these indicators as well through that official process. I hope that answers the question, but that was just a brief.
Yeah, one thing that I might add to that for people on the call is that the global indicators are really, just the top level steering ones, and while they're not perfect, there's opportunities to kind of make them more relevant within countries' national context. And we have seen in certain countries, for example, on 16.3 in Indonesia, they looked at the official global indicators, they weren't satisfied with them, they wanted additional measurement for monitoring how citizens are experiencing access to justice, and so they added complementary indicators, and so they can then take those up at the global level as well. So there's opportunities for individual countries to kind of improve the process and kind of go it alone without waiting for the official global piece, which is always a little slower.
Yeah, Stacey, can I come to the governance data from the World Bank? So the SDG16 Data Initiative is a coalition of civil society organizations that John has explained at the beginning of the webinar. But I have to say some of our data are composite data or composite indices which are presented in the data report. For example, the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index is a composite index, so we get multiple data in calculating that, and the World Bank governance data is included in it. So this is coming from the civil society. Some of the data actually gets data from some of the organizations get data from different sources, but that depends on the nature of the data that they produce and included in the report. So I can't speak for all the data which is included in the report, but I can, for example, you specifically ask about the governance data, and the corruption indicator in the governance data of World Bank is included in the Corruption Perception Index, which is represented in this report, for example.
And this is Michelle again, just to sort of hit at some of these questions. I think that, it is important to remember at which levels we're talking about right now. This is still the beginning, but the beginning, we're already 2 years into this process. 2030 is going to come faster than we think. So despite the fact that this is only the beginning, I think we really want to make use of what data exists already. And so since we're talking about the global level, we are looking at these, basically at these big global data sets where countries are comparable. What we're not doing is dissecting each country and pulling up subnational data sets, for instance, to complement these indicators. But I think in terms of trying to start to identify opportunities and challenges and understanding around these issues, this is really important. When we look at some of the, for instance, World Bank data, so Oksana mentioned that it's part of the Corruption Perceptions Index that we use. We also are looking, for instance, in developing effective institutions at indicators of regulatory governance that come from the World Bank. So there's really, you do have to rely on a lot of the intergovernmental organizations, international institutions that are able to provide data sets that are cross-country. And I think that also emphasizes the point that there is already a lot of data out there. And sometimes it can be boring work or tedious work to collect and compare that data in a way that's useful, but it's something that needs to be done. And so even just the work that the data initiative is doing to pull together the data sets, put them into Excel spreadsheets. At my organization, our researchers spend a lot of time doing just that, pulling data from PDFs into spreadsheets so that we can work with it. There is a lot of data out there, and it can show us a lot, even just in terms of thinking about where to invest next. And this is one of the reasons that I think also this initiative and this goal is particularly important. I mean, we've talked so much in the lead up to the adoption of the SDGs about no peace without development, no development without peace, but SDG16 is really a goal that links back to all other goals. There are a lot of relationships there, and there are initiatives that are trying to map out some of those relationships. But because peaceful societies is such a complex, multi-dimensional concept, there's no way that we can have just static indicator list like you can for some of the other goals. It's definitely not X plus Y equals Z here. So being able to capture that is really important, and I don't think that the other goals have that same challenge. So this is a constant effort in terms of not only measurement and monitoring, but also advocacy that this is a priority for the international community and for national governments.
Michelle, I might just, there was a question from Kelly McCarthy from Ireland. She's asked, will we publish any sort of official master data sets with all of the data that we have gathered? So what you were saying there about going through all the PDFs and putting them into Excel spreadsheets.
I think, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, is that available for download right now on the website? Most of this is open source data, so I'd have to actually just check to see if we have the spreadsheet that was developed available, but I don't see why we wouldn't make that available. And for individually at the Institute for Economics and Peace, organizationally, we do make data sets available, and so happy to liaise with anybody about any of those.
Yeah, Michelle, you're absolutely right. The data that we have is open source, and so it is available for download in various formats. So you can do it by, if you go to the main page, so the map, the SDG16 map with all of the indicators on the left side. On the right side, you'll see some plus and minus icons to zoom in and out on the map, but below that is a share button. And if you click on the share button, there's a download data link there, and you can download the data sets directly from the website there. So it's really quick and easy.
All right. Now the question, which Roxana might be most directed at you, to do with corruption, which comes from Daniel Meza in Honduras. The first question is broader. All three could take a stab at this, but he asked, do you think that all official data is reliable? And which aspects of peace, just, and inclusive is the most difficult to obtain data-wise? I think we'll all of it. So I'll let people come in on that. And specifically, he's talking about corruption in their country. He's saying they're having issues around public money being stolen by the President and First Lady. So how can something like the SDGs and the Global Corruption Index help at this level of corruption?
Okay, so we have data in relation to illicit flows of finances in the report, and I think each organization which compiles data and contributes data to this report does have a methodology, and we do stand by our methodology. And one of the ways that non-governmental data can be attacked is it's about credibility. But I think we often at Transparency International talked about sensitive issues such as corruption and bribery, and one of the ways that they can, the governments often can attack us is our methodology. And I think there is no foolproof methodology to say that this methodology is the most sound methodology and then we based our criteria on that. It's not about that, but I think to our best ability, given the circumstances, I think we all have adopted a credible methodologies in coming up with data and presenting data, and I think we do stand by that, and each organization does so. So that's part of the question, and I think how we calculate that and the methodology may not be available in this report, but in many of our organizational websites do carry this information. And I think I cannot give a very detailed answer to your country situation and how it's been calculated. But as I said, again, this to a certain extent relates to the methodologies as well. And Global Financial Integrity and other organizations do calculate how the money is flowing out of some of the countries and how much is being flown out each year, and how much is being invested in some of the tax havens across the globe. So again, it's a methodology issue, but the difficulty that we have, particularly in relation to corruption, is that often corruption happens behind closed doors, and so we do need other skills and other expertise to dive deeper in terms of both extracting information and data. But I can say one thing now. For example, our corruption perception index does talk about corruption situation in the public sector. When there is a bleak picture in relation to prevention of corruption, that also can create to a lot of other corrupt practices. When the judiciary is not working, when the access to justice is minimal, and when there is high bribery rate, so what does that really mean? And that actually creates an environment where any form of corruption and malpractices could happen. That's why I think we need to interpret the data holistically. I hope I answer to that question. To the best of my ability, that's the answer that I could give.
No, that's great. Very much running short on time, so I'm gonna put out some of the kind of questions that are left and open it to all three speakers to make interventions. We have a question from Jane, and I'm sorry, I'm going to botch your last name, which is Shukowski, who's asking more about the need for disaggregation and when this might come in on our website, I think. There's a question from Jamal Brown, who is asking about what measures are currently being taken towards the reclassification of key indicators under SDG16 and how the data initiative is supporting this process. And there's a question from Troy Radhakrishnan, again, apologies, around the actual high-level political forum. He's aware that the 2019 high-level political forum is going to look at SDG16, but what about countries who've already reported in the last few years? Will they still report on Goal 16, or will they have to report in the next cycle? He's specifically talking about in India this year they didn't report on Goal 16, so how will that come up in the next cycle? So I'll leave those questions and give you all 1 minute to answer those or make any kind of final interventions. Michelle, maybe I'll start with you.
Thank you for all the questions. I think I'll just make the comment that disaggregation is extremely important because different genders, different ethnicities, different ages obviously have completely different experiences. And one example is just looking at, for instance, the Gallup World Poll, which is one of the complementary indicators that we use in the data initiative about people's perceptions of safety. How safe do you feel walking alone at night? There's a question akin to that. The responses in terms of how safe people feel differ greatly just between men and women. So disaggregation is very important to be able to get a better sense of what the situation is for different groups. It's harder to find as much disaggregated data, but there is some there.
All right, and Roxana, final comments or response?
Okay, I think again on disaggregation of data, we need to bear in mind that data production of data is very expensive, but we try to disaggregate data as much as possible. But I think we all need to move towards inclusion of, as I said, indigenous communities and non-mainstream communities into the data reflection and bring those data into that. And I think we take it as something to carry forward. And reclassification of data, and I think we have an opportunity in 2019 to revisit some of the indicators and reclassify some of the indicators and produce data accordingly. And I think John could answer about the country reporting, but I think it's more important that countries do it's voluntary reporting, but I think most important that the organizations, civil society organizations who work at national level and subnational level get this data out and then use this data to measure how SDG has been achieved at their countries and create a discussion. I think that is the objective of this report as well. And that reach out is extremely important. I believe that many of you who are participating in this discussion will contribute to that and create a discussion, and I think we can take this discussion beyond this webinar, and very happy to contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. And John, maybe you could just touch on a little more on the country reporting and then any final interventions.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. So on the country reporting, unfortunately, I mean, reporting on the SDGs through the HLPF is entirely voluntary. So there's no requirement for countries to report in any kind of periodicity. And so that's obviously a real challenge for us. So for example, if they're not planning on reporting on a particular SDG, it's not a priority for them, then how do we ensure that we're getting a picture of progress on those issues? And again, I think as was mentioned before, I think that's where the SDG16 data initiative can help fill some of those gaps. But also I think it's important in this same context to have colleagues from civil society put together their own reports and utilize some of the data sets that we have you know, particularly on the website or even nationally focused. And answering the question previously about the reliability of official statistics, I think Michelle outlined pretty well some of the challenges that national statistical offices face in many cases. You know, a lot of NSOs are independent from their government, so I'm not sure that there's really a huge concern about manipulation of data necessarily, but there are huge capacity restraints, particularly in fragile states or developing countries. It's a massive issue that I think we're collectively going to have to address. I mean, what we're trying to do is provide some complementary indicators and data sources, but we do also have to address the issue of ensuring that national statistical offices are adequately you know, staffed and capable of reporting in their own accord. And then just one final point. So we had some questions about the downloading of the data. I forgot to mention, you have to actually click on the indicator on the left-hand side. So you have to open up each of the indicators. So click on the indicator first, and then click the download data button, and that'll download all of the data for that particular indicator. So there's no actual way to download the entire data set available. I think it's too heavy of a file to be able to download, but we have broken it up by indicator.
Great, and we'll make a note of that, and that's on our future list. We'll add it to the future list. We've got a long list. Well, a final plug. I know we've gone over, so thank you for everyone for sticking with us. As we said, the report is in there. You'll see global trends. You'll be able to look at what the data is telling us so far, what we still need to learn. You can go onto the website to look at your individual country. And we really encourage everyone to do this and to send feedback. This is our first report. We are definitely looking to learn and build on this and engage in dialogue over these kind of huge topics. So please do continue to stay in touch. We will have on the discussion platform on the Global Legal Empowerment Network, we will have a summary of this webinar, and you'll be able to ask questions directly to all of the panelists, and we can keep this discussion going there. So thank you to my colleagues, Michael, Ashley, Maya, and Kate, for fielding the questions. Thank you so much to John, Roxana, and Michelle for their great and informative presentations. And thank you to you all for joining. It's been a great discussion this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are. We will send out an email after this webinar with all of the information as to where to reach the discussion if you have more questions, and how to access all of the report and website. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. I'll let our panelists say bye as well.
Great.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Great.